I was just a maid in the mafia boss's mansion, a quiet shadow among guns, gold, and laughter soaked in power. Until the night he saw another man touch my hand. Just one touch, and he lost control. Luciano Devereaux, the cold, untouchable king of the underworld, shattered his wineglass in his fist. Blood mixed with red wine dripped onto the marble floor. "Don't let any man touch you," he growled, voice hoarse from restraint. I looked him straight in the eye. "You don't own me." His gaze darkened as if I were the only thing in the world he couldn't control. I used to be his servant. Now I was the reason the mafia boss went insane. It's hard to even start telling this part of the story, because it takes me right back to the beginning of the storm, before things went completely sideways, back when I was just trying to keep my head down and survive one day to the next, scrubbing floors to forget that I'd once held a scalpel. You know, I'm talking about that kind of quiet, desperate survival, where every small thing feels monumental, like the weight of a damp sponge or the glare of a polished floor. That was my life inside the Devereaux mansion. I felt like a ghost, which was exactly what I needed to be, because the last thing I wanted was for anyone, especially Luciano, to look too closely at me. Aria Laurent, the girl who was supposed to be a doctor, not a cleaner. Being invisible was my armor, and I was good at it, moving through those vast, silent halls, where the only sounds were the expensive grandfather clocks chiming and the quiet click of security guards' boots. A relentless rhythmic sound that always reminded me I was constantly under guard. I kept telling myself this is temporary. A strange detour, but every day those white marble floors and the cold, oppressive silence of the mansion seemed to shrink my world just a little bit more, making the outside reality, the one where I had a name and a career, feel like a long-forgotten dream, a life that belonged to a different person entirely. The truth is, I was running not just from the law, but from the searing, unforgettable memory of the mistake that forced me out of the operating room, a fatal incident tied up in the dark, messy knots of the criminal underworld, something I carried like a deep internal scar that sometimes ached when the weather changed. Every time I polished a silver handle, its reflection momentarily blinded me, and I saw the glint of the surgical steel I was supposed to be wielding, and the sheer irony of my position trading life-saving precision for domestic servitude was a constant stinging reminder of my fall from grace. I was an intellect hiding behind a uniform performing menial tasks to quiet a brilliant, restless mind, and the harder I scrubbed, the deeper I buried the shame of having traded my entire brilliant future for a life spent in the shadows of a tyrant who had no idea what kind of asset he was wasting. This is the part of the story where things start getting messy. Right before the big scene, and since we're talking about things that grab you and hold you, if this story is touching you even a little bit, could you take a quick second, open up your phone, and just tap the like button? It helps so much more than you know. And if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, let me know in the comments below. I read everyone, and they really keep me going. Tell me about the moment you finally proved everyone wrong. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We're in this together. And I want you to walk with me right through the rest of this journey, especially through the moments where the line between villain and victim completely dissolved. It's important to me that this story reaches anyone who's ever had to hide who they really are just to survive a hostile world. So hit that button, drop a quick comment, and let's dive back into the mansion, right into the moment where Luciano decided I wasn't invisible anymore, but was instead a fascinating, dangerous nuisance. The first real moment he forced me to confront that world of wealth and power, the world I desperately wanted to stay hidden from, was during one of the Devereaux family's massive, sickeningly opulent banquets. Imagine a hall the size of a church, filled with the loud, booming laughter of men who smelled like old money and cigars, and women dripping in jewels that could feed my old neighborhood for a year, their heavy diamond necklaces catching the light with every dismissive tilt of their heads. The chandeliers alone looked heavy enough to crush a small car, their light reflecting off the polished surfaces until the whole room felt overwhelmingly bright and dangerously exposed, like a stage set for a Greek tragedy. The air was thick and heavy with rich perfumes, and the stench of entitlement, a nauseating mix of expensive tobacco and predatory arrogance. And I was given a task that was clearly meant to be a deliberate public humiliation a way to remind everyone, and maybe Luciano himself, exactly where I stood in that food chain. They made me kneel right there on the black granite floor, near the main dining table, scrubbing a stain that wasn't even there. A manufactured stain designed only to make me lower myself, to physically and psychologically place me beneath the shoes of the guests and the servants who stood watching from the periphery. I could feel the heat radiating off the tables, the lingering warmth of the cooked food, and the bodies hear the clinking of expensive crystal, the scraping of solid gold cutlery, and the low, cruel murmurs of the guests watching me from their elevated cushioned chairs. And I just focused on the rough texture of the scrubbing brush, the tiny stiff bristles scratching the marble, letting the physical sensation ground me while trying to ignore the tidal wave of shame threatening to drown me right there in front of the most dangerous people in the city. The women in particular watched me with a bored, detached disdain, their perfectly manicured hands raising crystal flutes to their lips as if observing a poorly trained animal, and their collective judgment was a heavy, suffocating weight on my back. But I held my shoulders square, refusing to slouch, refusing to acknowledge the intentional theatrical cruelty of the spectacle holding on to the last sliver of my former dignity. I kept my eyes fixed on the tile, counting the tiny flecks of mica in the granite, analyzing the precise composition of the stone to keep my mind busy, not daring to look up, trying to disappear into the monotonous act of cleaning. But you can't exactly disappear when you're on your knees in the center of 100 people who've decided you're their evening's entertainment. That's when I heard the voice thick and slurring from too much champagne right above my ear, and it was one of Luciano's younger, flashier thugs, the kind of guy who compensates for his lack of real power, with a lot of noise and cheap arrogance. A man whose insecurity was always visible just beneath his expensive tailored suit. He leaned down close enough for me to smell the sickly sweet alcohol and cheap cologne on his breath, and sneered loud enough for the entire table to hear, twisting his lips into a smirk. Guess the boss got tired of high-class women, didn't he? Cheap toys now, huh? Gotta get down and dirty, sometimes use the help. And a ripple of nasty, knowing laughter followed a chorus of high-pitched giggles and deep, cynical chuckles that felt like physical blows. The heat rushed to my face, a burning wave of indignation and shame, but I kept scrubbing, digging the brush into the floor so hard my knuckles turned white and started to ache, not reacting, because reacting was what they wanted, and I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, wouldn't let them see the truth that the shame was real. But the resilient spirit they wanted to crush was fiercely intact. I risked a glance toward the head of the table, where Luciano was seated, stone-faced, leaning back in his chair, with a perfect, unnerving stillness that bordered on frozen, his eyes giving away absolutely nothing, a terrifying black vacuum of control that sucked all the warmth from the room. The fact that he heard it, heard the vile implication that I was merely a fleeting, low-status diversion he used and discarded, and didn't even twitch, didn't defend me, or even register the insult, felt like a deliberate blow, a clear confirmation that he was the warden of this cage, and I was nothing more than a creature he held captive for his own silent, complicated, and deeply cruel reasons, using my humiliation as a strange kind of entertainment. Then, of course, the inevitable happened, because when you're trying desperately not to draw attention to yourself, the universe steps in to make sure you do. And it was something ridiculously small, just a flicker of light hitting the marble and momentarily blinding me. I'd been so focused on the scrubbing, on holding my breath, and maintaining my posture, on trying to mentally disappear, that my hand slipped, hitting the pedestal of a crystal decanter, and sending a half-full glass of dark red, impossibly expensive wine tumbling over. It landed with a soft, sickening splash, right onto the pristine, polished leather of Luciano's impossibly expensive custom-made shoe, the crimson stain spreading like a spreading injury across the dark surface, soaking the fine leather instantly. The silence that fell over the entire hall was instant and total, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that makes your ears ring, the abrupt cessation of 100 conversations, leaving a vacuum that felt dangerous, and I felt my heart plummet down to my stomach because I knew in that split second I had just signed my own death warrant over a spilled beverage that cost more than my monthly wages. I didn't dare move, just froze there on the floor, my eyes locked on the spreading stain, waiting for the explosion. The kind of volcanic, terrifying rage that I'd only heard whispered about in the servants' quarters. The kind of temper that could turn a man into a demon in an instant and reduce me to ashes. But when he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm, colder and sharper than any shout, cutting right through the silence, like a shard of ice being dragged across metal, the sound deliberately slow and measured. He didn't raise his voice, just looked down at the wine spreading slowly across his shoe, then down at me. His face impassive, and said with an unnerving, deliberate slowness that drew out the moment, making every second an eternity, "Clean it. With your hands." I didn't question it. I didn't pause. I just dropped the brush, my hand trembling faintly with a mix of terror and shame, and reached out to obey, running my fingers through the warm, sticky wine, feeling the cool, expensive leather underneath the thick liquid, wiping it clean from the shoe, while he watched a silent storm raging behind his completely unreadable expression, his gaze locked on mine with an unnatural intensity that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my soul, scrutinizing every tiny movement. In that moment, kneeling there, wiping wine off the shoe of a monster, feeling the rough texture of the leather beneath my fingers, the metallic tang of the spilled red wine in the air, I knew he wasn't punishing me for the wine. He was testing me, pushing me to my absolute limit, trying to find the exact point where my quiet resilience would finally shatter, trying to determine if I was truly as weak and compliant as my uniform and my position suggested, or if there was something dangerously strong hidden beneath the facade. The humiliation of that night settled over me like a heavy sodden cloak, but it also started something else. A new dynamic between us that was rooted in silence and observation. A secret tension that was thicker than any formal interaction or any of the forced politeness in that house. I went back to being a shadow, even more careful than before, disappearing into my routine. But now I was a shadow with a secret knowledge. Luciano didn't just ignore me. He watched me constantly, and I watched him back, a necessary form of defense in that terrifying house that felt like a permanent chess game. My doctor's mind, always running a subtle diagnostic in the background, noticed things no one else would. The way his eyes held a specific, almost desperate exhaustion. The dark, bruised circles beneath them that no amount of wealth or flawless grooming could hide, betraying a deep, sustained physiological distress. I saw the faint tremor in his hand when he reached for his second glass of bourbon at 3 a.m, a tremor that spoke not of intoxication, but of adrenal fatigue and deep chronic stress, the physical toll of constant hypervigilance. I heard the small guttural sound of distress he sometimes made behind the closed doors of his study, muffled by the heavy wood, but clearly audible in the dead of night. A sound like a man choking on his own guilt, the sound of a nightmare clawing its way into his consciousness. I wasn't just observing a boss. I was seeing a man who was deeply, truly afflicted. A man who rarely slept, whose life seemed to be an endless, agonizing cycle of wakefulness and recurring nightmares that left him pale and defeated, even when he was sitting perfectly upright, commanding his empire with terrifying authority. I could recognize the clinical signs of chronic PTSD-induced insomnia instantly: the hypervigilance, the irritability, the physical collapse, the frantic search for relief. It was a familiar pathology, just one I hadn't treated with a sponge and a bucket before. And the sight of such intense, naked suffering, even in a monster, stirred the old professional instinct that I could never quite turn off, the deep-seated urge to alleviate suffering, regardless of who the patient was. It was this observation that led me to break one of my own unbreakable rules, engaging with his personal life, stepping outside the rigid lines of the Maid and into the dangerous territory of the healer. I couldn't ignore the clear medical need, the sheer unsustainable level of sleep deprivation he was suffering from, knowing that prolonged insomnia could lead to psychosis or fatal mistakes. And the old instincts, the training that was burned into my bones, refused to let me just stand by and watch a human being destroy himself from the inside out. So I started leaving small, discreet things for him, not some obvious grand gesture that would expose my intentions, but a cup of a specific, precise blend of herbal tea, prepared meticulously in the kitchen under the guise of an upset stomach cure, for a minor servant, but placed not in his room where a servant might notice it, but on his desk, in the empty study, timed exactly for when he'd usually be settling in for another failed night of rest. It was a complex pharmaceutical-grade mixture of high-dose valerian root blended carefully with passion flower to ease anxiety and neurological excitability, and a rare type of hops extract known for its powerful sedative effects, a careful blend designed to interrupt his neurological stress cycle. This was something that only someone with a deep, specialized knowledge of medicinal chemistry and botany, someone like a doctor who had spent years dealing with trauma and chemical dependency patients, would ever know or formulate, let alone source. And I had risked everything to procure the precise ingredients. I was playing a dangerous game, leaving that tiny silent flag of my true identity, a risk that could easily be seen as an attempt to poison or incapacitate him. But the alternative, watching him physically collapse under the weight of his own mind, eventually leading to a potentially lethal mistake in his volatile world, was something my core being couldn't allow. The blend wasn't an immediate cure, but it offered a gentle, chemically precise push toward rest, a temporary, desperately needed reprieve from the constant torture of his own conscience and his past. He caught on immediately, of course. Luciano didn't miss a thing. That's how he stayed alive and in power, by recognizing the slightest anomaly in his controlled world, by tracking deviations from the norm. The first time the tea vanished, replaced by an empty washed cup that smelled subtly of lavender and herbs, I knew he'd noticed. The second time I saw him examining the empty cup with the forensic intensity of a detective, his brow furrowed with suspicion and a dangerous curiosity, turning the delicate porcelain over in his hands as if trying to read the secrets embedded in the glaze, scrutinizing the residue at the bottom. He tracked me down the only way he knew how, by simply waiting until I was alone, vulnerable, and cornering me, which he did one rainy night in his massive study, the room smelling faintly of leather wood smoke, and the distant, subtle yet familiar scent of the vanished tea, the scent he was now chasing. Suddenly he was just there, his body a hard, immovable presence blocking the heavy doorway, his tailored suit suddenly looking like a cage for his own immense tension. The tension in that moment was so thick I could barely breathe. I could hear the rain hitting the glass behind me, a steady drumming that felt slow and loud, the only sound apart from the terrifying silence of his proximity. He didn't threaten me right away, didn't raise his voice, just walked slowly towards me, closing the physical distance with agonizing slowness, his eyes dark and piercing the coldness I knew so well in his gaze, now tinged with something else, a frustrated need, an admission of his own involuntary reliance on me. He stopped just inches away, towering over me, forcing me to tilt my chin up to meet his eyes, and then he asked, his voice low and dangerous, demanding the truth. "Who are you really, Arya? What are you trying to do to me with that tea? Is this a slow poison?" I just stood there completely still, gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my fingers ached, my mind racing through every single lie and half-truth I could offer, and chose the only safe option that wouldn't betray my past silence. I refused to answer, refused to give him the power of my story, just met his gaze, steadily unflinching, which seemed to frustrate the violent predator in him more than any flimsy obvious lie could have, forcing him to deal with the uncomfortable truth of his dependence. He kept staring at me, a long, agonizing silence where the only thing that moved was the pulse pounding visibly in the small hollow space above my collarbone. And I watched as the mask of suspicion and control finally cracked, just a hairline fracture revealing something raw, exhausted, and desperately needy underneath the look of a man who hadn't rested in 3 years. His eyes fell from mine to the scar hidden beneath my maid's sleeve, the invisible scar that my doctor's instinct couldn't let me forget, the scar of my mistake. He took a small step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, almost broken whisper that was startlingly intimate, completely different from the cold commands I was used to hearing. It was a sound of defeat, a surrender to a weakness he couldn't fight anymore, a plea disguised as a statement. "You're the only one who makes me sleep, Arya." He confessed the admission heavy with both gratitude and resentment, the sheer unmasked vulnerability in that statement. That single unguarded admission from the most feared man in the city hit me with a force that made my knees weak, confirming that the tea, the simple quiet act of healing, had become his singular lifeline. It wasn't a threat. It was an act of involuntary confession, a monster admitting that the quiet maid was the single fragile key to his only moments of peace, the only remedy his tormented soul could respond to, proving the power of my quiet intervention. I didn't say anything, just looked at the genuine, crippling weariness carved into the lines around his eyes, And in that moment, I understood that his sleeplessness wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a self-imposed constant punishment of guilt, a nightly penance for everything he had done. And I, the person he had once forced to wipe wine from his shoe, was somehow providing the undeserved grace he desperately needed, binding our fates together with an invisible, complicated medical thread that neither of us could sever or fully understand, a connection built on his deepest weakness and my hidden strength. This strange, fragile truce, this silent language built on herbal tea and shared wakefulness, shattered completely with the arrival of Ethan Cross, the new security consultant. Ethan, a former special agent with a background in federal law enforcement, was everything Luciano was not: clean-cut professional and radiating a calm, ethical competence that felt foreign in the mansion's decadent atmosphere, a man who looked like he belonged on a bright, sunny street, not in these dark halls. Crucially, he had the unsettling habit of actually seeing me, meeting my eyes, and acknowledging my existence as a person, not a piece of furniture. And he always spoke with that calm, steady way that made me feel like an actual human being again. Like the doctor I used to be, not the invisible maid recognizing my competence when others only saw a uniform. His presence immediately introduced a different kind of tension into the house, a cleaner, more unsettling kind of friction that had nothing to do with the usual mafia power plays, but everything to do with the unexpected lightness that started to accompany my days, a tiny sliver of hope. That I wasn't entirely lost, a warmth that was entirely incompatible with Luciano's suffocating cold. This lightness was unfortunately completely visible to everyone, especially Luciano, who watched our minimal interactions: a shared glance over a faulty lock, a brief word about a scheduled maintenance, an accidental brush of shoulders in the kitchen with a predatory stillness like a viper tracking a field mouse. It all came to a head during a sudden, chaotic security breach, one of those loud, terrifying moments where the mansion suddenly transformed from a luxury estate into a heavily armed fortress, the air immediately filled with the sound of breaking glass and the muffled rattle of automatic weapons as attackers breached the east wing. Ethan found me cornered and disoriented in a darkened corridor, pinned down by a flurry of gunfire that had taken out a row of priceless porcelain vases near the staircase, the sharp shards flying everywhere. Ethan reacted instantly and professionally, moving with a controlled, lethal efficiency that only special training can instill, the instinct of a protector, honed over years of crisis and high-stakes situations. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm and impersonal, pulling me out of the direct line of fire and slamming us both against a thick stone pillar near the main atrium, shielding my body with his own, the impact momentarily knocking the wind out of me. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, leaving me breathless and dizzy, making my hands shake uncontrollably. And when the immediate danger had passed and the gunman had retreated to regroup, he looked down at me, his eyes full of genuine, unfeigned concern, and just held my hand for a brief moment, checking my pulse and ensuring I was responsive. It was a single, reassuring human touch meant to anchor me in the terrifying reality of the moment, a physical transfer of stability. When I felt like I was dissolving into fear, his thumb rubbing gently over my knuckles. It was a gesture of pure, simple protection, nothing romantic or suggestive, just one person supporting another after a close call. But that tiny 5-second connection, that small public act of intimacy and care, was of course the exact moment Luciano chose to appear, walking into the corridor from the western wing, his gun lowered, but his face more dangerous than any weapon. He walked into the corridor, stepping over the debris and the fallen bodies of guards, and saw the entire scene play out. Ethan holding my hand, both of us leaning against the pillar, the picture of intimacy and shared survival. The air immediately changed, becoming thick and suffocating. The scent of gunpowder replaced by the chilling, palpable aura of a man whose composure had just been fundamentally broken. And before Ethan could even drop my hand, Luciano's face had gone utterly, frighteningly blank, a look more terrifying than any open display of anger, because it signaled a terrifying internal explosion of rage and insecurity. The resulting explosion wasn't physical, not right away, but the moment he saw us, the rumor machine started up and went viral, spreading through the mansion and beyond, like wildfire fueled by the guards who had witnessed the scene. It was whispered in the kitchens, hissed in the laundry rooms, and repeated with malicious delight by the guards at the gate. The boss went absolutely crazy because his maid let another man touch her. She's sleeping with the new security guy. The possessiveness in that rumor was suffocating, reducing me from a person to an object, a toy whose owner had been slighted and dishonored, and it proved just how much the men in that house, Luciano included, misunderstood the core of who I was. They saw an affair where there was only an exchange of human comfort and a professional rescue. He didn't say a word to me until hours later, after the chaos of the security sweep had subsided, dragging me not by the arm, but by the sheer force of his furious presence, his shadow preceding me down the hall into his private office and slamming the massive oak door behind us, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the recovered stillness of the mansion. I stood rigid in the center of the room, bracing myself, my body preparing for the inevitable physical blow. But instead of hitting me, he grabbed the nearest object, an ornate crystal glass filled with dark liquid, and hurled it against the stone fireplace, where it shattered into a million sparkling, meaningless pieces. The aggression deflected, but the danger palpable, the sound shocking and absolute. He spun around, breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his face a mask of raw, visceral, undisguised jealousy that was both terrifying and strangely pathetic. The mask of the untouchable boss completely ripped away to reveal the raging, wounded man underneath. He repeated the command from the banquet, only this time, the underlying fury was completely unleashed, his voice shaking with the effort of holding back true violence that was clawing to get out. "I told you!" He bit out his voice, a low, gravelly snarl that scraped the air, his eyes blazing. "Don't let any man touch you, Arya. Not ever. Do you understand the consequences of that kind of intimacy here?" I stood there utterly calm amidst the wreckage of the glass, and his rage, the remnants of the crystal glittering around my feet. And in that moment I realized I had to push back, had to remind him that even though I wore a maid's uniform, my spirit was not his property, was not for sale, and was certainly not something he could claim ownership over, even if he saved my life 10 times over. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice level and icy, deliberately cold to counter his heat, the words sharp and final, and stated, "I belong to no one, Luciano. I am not yours. No one. The only thing you own is my labor, and you pay me for that." That single sentence, that absolute assertion of my autonomy, was the final pinprick that popped the last bubble of his control. I watched his eyes turn black with frustrated, explosive violence, and he lifted his hand, his massive fist clenched, ready to strike, ready to silence the defiance in my eyes once and for all, the shadow of his fist looming large. He held it there, frozen in the air between us, trembling with the desperate effort of control, his entire body locked in a fight against his own instinct, and then in a stunning display of restraint that was more shocking than any punch, a clear sign that he valued my defiance over his own need for dominance. He slammed his fist into the stone wall beside my head, instead, the impact generating a sickening, muffled thud that vibrated through the floor and up into my shoes, shaking the entire room. The moment he pulled his hand back, blood immediately began to drip onto the plush carpet from his raw, shattered knuckles. But he didn't even wince, just stood there staring at the growing stain, proving that the wall was the only thing he dared to touch, when faced with my complete, unyielding refusal to be owned, showing me with agonizing clarity that his jealousy had exposed the weakness he had spent a lifetime desperately denying, and that I was his singular, forbidden obsession, the one thing he could not crush. The aftermath of that explosion left a dangerous, palpable strain between us, an invisible tripwire that we were both constantly aware of, but it was also the incident that inadvertently led to the most crucial discovery of my time in that mansion. My surgical instincts, the way I had to constantly scan, observe, and look past the surface, searching for the underlying pathology, were always on high alert, and it was that trained observation that snagged on a small, subtle anomaly I found tucked away in a remote, dust-covered corner of Luciano's private, rarely accessed vault during a rare cleaning assignment. The vault, hidden behind a false bookcase, was usually filled with ledgers and currency, but this corner held a small, locked, fireproof box. It wasn't a hidden weapon or a ledger of illicit deals, which would have been expected, but a sealed, aged medical record bound in thick cardboard, the kind of heavy stock paper and precise formatting that immediately felt familiar, clinical, and intimately connected to my former life. I knew I shouldn't have. I knew the penalty for intrusion was likely death, but the professional curiosity was too strong to resist, and utilizing the tiny tools I still kept hidden in my uniform pocket. A surgeon's habit, I managed to pick the small lock. I opened it, scanning the pages with lightning speed, focusing on the operative report. The moment I saw the surgical notes and the detailed patient history, the blood rushed from my face, leaving me suddenly lightheaded and cold, a wave of sickening recognition washing over me. The file was detailing a highly complex, almost impossible emergency surgery performed 3 years prior, a surgery that had saved the patient's life, following a brutal ambush that left him clinically dead on the operating table, suffering from major internal hemorrhage and a ruptured spleen. The surgeon listed was me, Aria Laurent, using a slightly altered name that protected my identity, but was unmistakable to me. And the patient was Luciano Devereaux himself. I was the surgeon. He was the man whose life I had saved in secret, operating under the cloak of the criminal underworld because his injuries were too sensitive, too dangerous to take to a regular hospital, an event I had scrubbed from my memory, thinking it was just a one-off, terrifying mistake from my past life, a final dark act before I disappeared entirely and buried my oath. This hidden file suddenly made everything clear: the sleeplessness, the guilt, the strange, possessive intensity of his gaze, the way he had sought me out and kept me near even as a maid. He hadn't just met me when I became his servant. He had already been tethered to me by a life-or-death debt he never wanted to acknowledge, an unconscious knowledge that the hands that cleaned his floors were the same ones that had stitched his heart back together under the dim light of an illegal operating theater. The knowledge that he owed me his life and that he kept the record locked away explained the desperate conflict in his eyes every time he looked at me. However, that revelation didn't stay secret for long, because the mansion was a dense network of spies and informants, and Ethan, suspicious of my constant quiet movements, my unusual expertise with the tea, and my unnaturally calm demeanor in crisis, had started his own discreet investigations, looking for any information he could leverage. He hadn't found the medical file, but he had traced my altered name back to my medical university records. He reported his findings directly to Raphael Devereaux. Raphael, Luciano's older half-brother, was a man who moved like smoke and silk, calm, impeccably dressed, always smiling, yet with eyes that held the unsettling depth and coldness of a barren ocean. A man who gave the illusion of warmth while radiating absolute zero, utterly devoid of the messy passion that drove Luciano. He listened patiently to Ethan's report, took the information about my former profession as a surgeon, and with the kind of smooth, quiet malice that only a true manipulator possesses, he twisted it and leaked the perfect poisonous rumor into the volatile ecosystem of the family. The whispers changed overnight from jealous gossip to genuine existential fear. The maid once worked for our enemies? She's a plant of viper hidden in the house, placed here to finish the job. She started 3 years ago. She's a sleeper agent waiting for the final signal. When Luciano heard the new rumor, the last shred of his controlled suspicion and complicated affection snapped the revelation that his savior might be his assassin, proving too much for his fragile psyche. This time, the coldness was absolute, stripped of any underlying heat of jealousy or confusion, replaced by a terrible, clear-eyed distrust and a fierce need for self-preservation. He didn't shout or break anything. He simply sent his most trusted, most emotionless guards to detain me, ordering my immediate imprisonment for interrogation, a demand that carried the chilling finality of an execution order. When I was brought before him, standing in that same office where he'd punched the wall for me, the wound on his hand, now a dark, ugly scab, his eyes were flat, hard, and cold as knives, confirming that he had completely shut off whatever flicker of connection we had shared, seeing me only as a lethal threat, a dangerous loose end to be dealt with before I could destroy his entire world. I knew I had one chance, one single bullet of truth to fire that might pierce his armor of rage and fear, and I looked him straight in the eyes, my voice barely a whisper, a stark clinical statement of fact, meant to jog his memory of the sterile operating theater and the desperate moments I saved your life once, Luciano. I was the one who pulled you back from the hemorrhage and the trauma. The impact of the truth was visible, a momentary tightening around his jaw, a flicker of profound pain and betrayal in his stone-cold gaze as the memory surfaced. But he recovered instantly, his resolve hardening like concrete, turning his hidden fear into public cruelty and an unforgiving pragmatism. He simply met my desperate plea with a crushing counter-statement, a quiet, definitive reply that twisted the knife of my fate with precision. "Then you ruined mine, Arya, by making me owe my life to a ghost who now hunts me. You gave me life only to threaten everything I have built." That moment confirmed that our bond was not one of affection or respect, but one of complicated, inescapable debt guilt, and a desire that felt like a curse binding us together in a prison of his making, where suspicion was the only language left, and my past was now the chain around my neck. The prison he created for me was not a dark, dank dungeon which would have been easier to endure, offering the solace of complete darkness and isolation, but something far more insidious, a gilded cage designed to break the spirit through constant, unyielding surveillance. I was locked in a glass room situated in a remote, unused wing of the mansion, a modernist nightmare of transparency, where every single movement, every sigh, every moment of vulnerability was visible to anyone who walked by, but especially to Luciano, who had access to the live feed constantly projected onto a screen in his office. The security was state-of-the-art, the glass shatterproof, the locks impenetrable, and the utter exposure of it was the true torture, the ultimate psychological weapon, meant to strip me of my privacy and my dignity, to make me feel constantly judged and on display. The room was sparsely furnished, a cot with thin sheets, a small metal table, a single uncomfortable chair, all designed to highlight my captivity and diminish my existence. A sterile environment meant to extinguish any spark of hope. The servants, forever cruel and forever whispering, quickly gave it a name delivered with malicious giggles. The boss's little bird in a gilded cage, a title that stung with the humiliation of my diminished status and his suffocating possessive control, reducing me to a fragile, beautiful possession. I tried to maintain my dignity, to simply exist within the glass walls, as if I were still invisible. Reading the medical books I'd smuggled in, or attempting exercises to calm my mind, but the sheer relentless scrutiny was crushing, turning my quiet resilience into brittle exhaustion, knowing that every moment of weakness was observed. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I just sat a spectacle of my own despair, waiting for the inevitable end, the kind of slow, quiet breakdown that he was orchestrating so meticulously, testing how long it would take for the doctor to become the patient, for the healer to become the broken subject. He visited me every single night, always at the exact same time, right when the late-night darkness had settled over the mansion, making the glass reflect the single overhead light, and his own unreadable, looming face turning him into a specter. He never came inside. He would simply stand on the other side of the partition, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for only 5 minutes. But the duration was irrelevant. It was the act of watching that mattered. He never spoke a single word, just stood like a sentinel, his massive frame silhouetted against the dark hallway, watching, his eyes following every tiny tremor of my hand, every shift in my posture, every flicker of emotion across my face, cataloging my destruction. It was the most unnerving, terrifying silence I had ever experienced, a complete negation of any human connection, a refusal to even acknowledge the sound of my breathing, and I felt the walls of my sanity begin to cave in under the weight of his endless, silent gaze, the feeling of being perpetually judged and studied, wearing me down into nothingness. One night, after nearly a week of this unrelenting surveillance, the sheer psychological pressure became too much, and I finally snapped. The controlled exterior I had maintained for years finally cracked, and I sank to the floor, my hands clutching my head, sobbing with a raw, desperate intensity that felt like a physical tearing of my soul. I looked up at him through the glass, my face tear-streaked and shattered, and spoke the truth of my ruin, shouting at him through the thick, soundproof partition, my voice hoarse with pain. "You've already destroyed what's left of me, Luciano. You've taken everything. My career, my peace, my identity. Why not just kill me and get it over with?" He stood there completely motionless, listening to the muffled, pathetic sound of my broken voice, and when my despair had finally exhausted itself into heavy, ragged silence, he leaned closer to the glass, his mouth barely moving. His voice, quiet, almost mournful, yet utterly definitive, responding with the most chilling possessive line I had ever heard delivered, with the sorrow of a man who knows he's committing an atrocity no aria. I'm just keeping what's mine. You belong to me, and now you'll stay where I can see you safe from my enemies and safe from yourself. His love had curdled entirely into possession. His need for control had transformed into a cage that he too was trapped within, seeing me not as a person deserving freedom, but as a priceless, dangerous artifact. He needed to keep locked away for his own twisted security, believing he was protecting me by caging me. It was during my time in that glass room, stripped of my defenses, and forced to do nothing but think that the true terrifying picture of the mansion's internal politics began to emerge not through overt action, but through the subtle, dangerous hints Ethan unintentionally dropped during his perimeter checks, and the data streams I could observe on the guards' handheld devices outside my enclosure. I noticed his visits were too frequent, his questions too specific, his demeanor too polished for a mere security consultant, and putting his former special agent status together with the way Raphael was suddenly positioned to take over more of Luciano's assets. The truth clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Ethan wasn't just a new hire. He was an undercover Interpol agent, and I, the former surgeon with connections to the underworld, was likely the leverage, the hidden path he was trying to use to bring the entire Devereaux empire down, and most importantly, bring Luciano down. He wasn't trying to save me. He was using me as bait, but the deeper, more chilling realization was the role of Raphael. He was the puppet master, not just colluding with Interpol, but actively feeding them misinformation, positioning himself to eliminate his half-brother in the resulting chaos, and seize power without firing a single shot, using the state as his weapon against his own family, hiding his ambition beneath a veneer of calm loyalty. Luciano was a monster of necessity, driven by trauma and survival. Raphael was a monster of ambition, driven by cold, calculating greed, and his evil was far more insidious. I was trapped in a moral abyss, faced with a choice that felt impossible. I could stay quiet, let the Interpol plan unfold, secure my own freedom, finally escaping the monstrous man who had caged me, or I could choose to save the man who had tormented me, the man who had claimed ownership of my broken spirit, but who was perhaps the lesser of two evils. The choice, however, wasn't about love, nor was it about forgiveness. It was about justice. A cold, hard, clinical calculation of which man was the true greater monster, and Raphael's cold, manipulative betrayal, his willingness to use his own brother and the authorities for power, was a far deeper malignancy than Luciano's twisted, possessive passion. Luciano was a brute. Raphael was a parasite. I knew I couldn't simply watch a man die for the crime of having loved and lost his mind over me, especially not by the hand of a traitor wearing his brother's face, a man who had murdered his own blood. From my vantage point in the glass room, I began to observe the digital signature of the security system, studying the rotation schedules, the blind spots, and the timing of the guards' electronic key passes, meticulously mapping out the system's vulnerabilities and its network structure. I formulated a desperate, high-risk plan to sabotage the assassination plot that Raphael had coordinated with the Interpol team, a plan that involved a tiny, almost imperceptible modification to the house's electronic security grid's delay sequence, something only someone with high-level technical skills could have accomplished, without tripping an alarm, a subtle redirect in the internal monitoring system that would buy Luciano's team precious seconds. I waited until the moment of the planned strike when the Interpol team was already breaching the outer wire. When the operation finally commenced, signaled by the distant sound of breaking glass and the muffled cries of surprise as the Interpol team breached the outer perimeter, I executed my sabotage via a repurposed old cleaning tablet I had managed to hide and rewire. The digital manipulation caused a momentary critical lapse in the security grid that lasted exactly 5 seconds, just enough time to reroute the internal defense teams and allow Luciano's loyalist men to repel the initial coordinated assault, turning the carefully orchestrated Interpol raid into a catastrophic failure and scattering the attack force. Later that night, in the aftermath of the violence and the quiet hum of the recovering house, Luciano came to my glass cage, his face smeared with dust, a deep, fresh gash above his eye, the look of exhaustion giving way to a new kind of bewilderment. And I watched as the absolute confusion in his eyes warred with a grudging, disbelieving admiration. He stood there silent for a long time, the tension building until he finally whispered the question heavy with disbelief and the dawning recognition of my power and complex loyalty. You betrayed them. For me, Arya, why, you could have walked free. And in that moment, I knew I had done the only thing I could do, an act of true loyalty that wasn't born of servitude or desire, but of a quiet, unyielding moral code that he for the very first time seemed to understand and respect. My act of saving him, however, did nothing to stop the relentless mockery of the outside world, which Raphael was only too happy to facilitate pouring salt into the freshly opened wound of Luciano's perceived weakness and his bizarre obsession with the maid. The underworld was relentless, their scorn echoing across the airwaves, and in every coded message Luciano's lost his mind. Over the maid, he let her poison him with softness. And now he's weak, a laughingstock, a man ruled by his servant. Raphael, seeing his elaborate plot for a clean takeover crumble, shifted tactics, launching a public relations war rooted in pure manufactured cruelty, releasing carefully edited, deeply manipulated footage of my supposed capture. The video was designed to show the powerful Luciano Devereux being brought down by a lowly begging maid, forcing him to choose between his empire and his alleged possession, a public dilemma designed to shatter his authority. The footage, a masterful piece of psychological warfare designed to shred his reputation, showed me Arya Laurent, apparently captured, shackled, and tearfully begging for my life, pleading with Luciano to give up his empire and his pride just to save my miserable skin, a performance achieved through clever editing and audio manipulation. It was a vile, twisted scene calculated to inflict the maximum amount of humiliation on him, to force him to choose between his power and the woman he obsessively possessed, knowing that either choice would destroy his reputation and authority completely in the eyes of his peers and the council he desperately needed to sway. When Luciano watched the footage in the viewing room, I was forced to stand beside him, a silent, damning presence as the underworld's laughter echoed through the screen, and I could feel the cold, heavy weight of the gun he gripped tightly in his right hand, its metal cold against his palm. The room was tense, suffocating, and I knew that if he chose to give up his power for the sake of the person he obsessed over, he would hate me forever, turning his possessiveness into a lifelong, bitter resentment that would be a far worse prison than the glass room. I looked at the screen, saw the manipulated version of myself pleading on my knees, a vision of weakness I despised. And I spoke to him, not looking at his face, but at the distorted, pathetic image of myself, my voice flat, cold, and utterly unforgiving, delivering the ultimate test of his control and his understanding of my character, my eyes blazing with defiance. "If you give up everything for me, Luciano," I stated with chilling finality, my eyes narrowed, daring him to make the sentimental choice, "I'll never forgive you. I won't be the ruin of you. I am not worth your kingdom." The words were a knife to his ego, a refusal to be his salvation, if it meant destroying him, a final declaration that my worth was not tied to his power or his weakness, demanding he stand on his own merits. He stood there, his entire body rigid, the muscles in his jaw twitching violently, staring at the screen, at the begging caricature of me, then down at the gun in his hand, then back to the defiant living woman standing beside him. And in that agonizing moment, he made his choice. With a sigh that seemed to drain all the air from the room, he simply turned away from the screen, turning his back on the begging woman, on the demand of the world, and on me choosing his pride and his power over the impossible sacrifice, choosing survival. The world took that act as confirmation Luciano had abandoned the maid. She was useless. She was dead to him, a disposable distraction whose influence had finally faded. What no one realized was that my refusal to beg, my cold final ultimatum, was the exact moment I truly earned his respect, and my own freedom to act. It was the moment he saw me as a strategic ally, not a liability. My staged refusal was part of a deeper, far more complex plot that I had secretly orchestrated with Raphael, a move born of sheer desperation and a cold-blooded need to survive. While the world believed I had been abandoned or even killed, I had struck a false deal with Raphael, pretending to align myself with his ambition, promising to give him all the information he needed to solidify his position after Luciano's downfall, knowing all along that I was simply buying myself the time and the access I needed to finish him first by gathering irrefutable proof of his decades-long deception. The opportunity came during a massive bloody purge Luciano initiated to stabilize his shaken empire, a chaotic period designed to eliminate external threats. And it was in the middle of this organized violence that a masked figure moving with the trained precision of a former emergency surgeon began systematically working through the ranks, saving key targets, destabilizing Raphael's internal network, and eventually standing over Luciano himself, guiding him toward the truth. That figure moving through the smoke and the chaos was me using the very chaos Raphael had hoped to exploit against him, a ghost moving within the machine operating with clinical precision. I revealed myself not with a flourish, but by simply dropping the mask in the quiet, empty hallway, where I finally cornered Luciano, who stared at me as if I were a ghost risen from the grave, his eyes wide with shock and the dawning realization of the scope of my defiance and ingenuity. I hadn't just survived. I had maneuvered myself back into the heart of the conflict, manipulating the manipulators. I didn't waste time on explanations, simply delivering the final devastating piece of truth that Raphael had spent a lifetime burying, the one piece of information that would instantly dismantle his entire power base. The man you call Raphael isn't your brother Luciano. He killed the real one years ago, disposing of him quietly during a business trip to Milan. He is an imposter, a weapon planted by a rival family to destroy you from within, and he's been running this entire conspiracy with Interpol, not for the family, but for himself, and their revenge biding his time as your confidant. The confession detonated the entire empire from within, shattering every assumption he had held about his life, his family, and his greatest enemy, who had been sitting at his dinner table for years, drinking his wine and plotting his demise. The look on Luciano's face, the raw, gut-wrenching realization that his entire foundation was a lie, was more painful than any physical blow, a sudden, complete loss of reality. Together with the remaining loyalists and the evidence I had meticulously collected while in my cage, utilizing the surveillance cameras he himself had used against me, we quickly exposed the conspiracy, presenting the irrefutable proof of Raphael's treachery, DNA evidence, forged documents, and coded communications that pinpointed the identity of the true killers to the assembled Mafia Council, a presentation that ended his reign of deception, not with a bang, but with a cold, definitive silence that saw the imposter stripped of his power, his influence, and his life, finally restoring a twisted form of justice to the empire I had almost accidentally destroyed. The resolution of the conspiracy brought a temporary, fragile peace, but Raphael, cornered and broken, was not a man who would fade quietly into the night, preferring to take the whole structure down with him in one final cataclysmic act of vengeance. We were in the compound's central security hub, surrounded by the flashing lights of the surveillance screens, just moments after the council's verdict had been delivered, and Raphael had been captured when the alarms began to shriek, deafening and immediate, and a chilling voice, Raphael's final distorted message, crackled over the intercom. "If I can't have the throne, Luciano, no one can. Enjoy the fire, brother." Before we could react, before the guards could secure Raphael's hidden detonator, the walls buckled, the ceilings groaned, and the entire compound began to shake violently, a terrifying, bone-jarring vibration that signaled the detonation of the carefully placed explosives he had planted throughout the estate, turning the entire mansion into a collapsing tomb of marble and glass. I was thrown violently across the room by the initial concussion, slamming into a console, the air knocked from my lungs, and when the dust began to settle, when the final agonizing cracks stopped running through the marble, I found myself lying amidst the ruins, bleeding heavily from a large, jagged piece of falling masonry that had struck my side with the force of a sledgehammer, the pain immediate and overwhelming. Luciano, who had instinctively thrown himself over me, shielding me from the worst of the debris, was immediately at my side, his usual cold, predatory focus completely gone, replaced by a raw, unbridled panic I had never seen before, a desperate fear that was entirely focused on me, on the blood spreading quickly across the white marble floor, staining it a violent crimson, a stark contrast to the dust and gray wreckage. He gathered me carefully into his arms, ignoring the pain in his own body and the smoke filling the air, his face white with shock, and his eyes burning with an agonizing mixture of love and guilt. The realization of what he was losing finally hitting him. He shouted, his voice hoarse and raw, rising above the groaning of the collapsing structure and the distant sirens, his final desperate assertion against the world that had always told him I was nothing. You were never just my maid. You were my equal. You were the only one who saw me never. The sheer conviction in his voice, the way it broke on the last word, was the truest confession of his feelings, a profound realization spoken at the moment of his own destruction. I looked up at his panicked face, fighting the rising blackness, and the pain, the agony in my side intense and debilitating, using the last of my strength to ask the question that had plagued me since the beginning, the question that defined my entire existence in his house, whispering weakly through the pain. Then, what am I, Luciano, if I was never your servant? What did I mean? He gripped me tighter, trembling, his composure completely shattered, looking down at me with tears finally streaming down his dusty face, and delivered the ultimate heartbreaking truth, the reason he had broken every rule he lived by, the reason he had become a monster trying to own a fragile bird. The only reason I'm still human, Arya. You're the only reason I'm still human, the only clean thing left in my entire rotten life, the only peace I ever found. In that moment of utter ruin, stripped of his kingdom, his dignity, and his defenses, the monster finally found his redemption in the broken woman he had once tried to chain the weight of his love, finally acknowledged at the peak of our shared tragedy, right before the roof collapsed entirely and everything went black. The world, looking at the wreckage, the massive cloud of smoke, and the reports of no survivors, simply assumed we were both dead, another casualty in the eternal war of the Mafia underworld, and for a long time, maybe we were metaphorically at least the old versions of ourselves, consumed by the inferno. But life, or perhaps fate, has a funny way of giving you a second chance when you stop fighting for the wrong things and start working toward quiet, simple dignity. A year later, you wouldn't find me in a palace or a prison, but in a small, sun-drenched monastery, nestled high in the hills outside Florence, surrounded by the ancient, comforting smell of herbs and stone, where I finally returned to the healing I was meant for, tending to orphans and refugees with the same quiet care I once tried to give a brutal mafia boss, finally reclaiming my oath. I had traded the blood-soaked marble for the smooth-worn wood of a simple clinic, replacing my maid's uniform with a clean, unassuming linen dress. My past life finally a distant echo, finally finding my peace in meaningful, quiet work, teaching the children about the healing power of the earth. The quiet routine had become my anchor, my peace, until one cool afternoon when a figure appeared at the clinic door, casting a tall, familiar shadow that instantly raised the hairs on the back of my neck. He looked different, older, scarred, with a blind, milky film over his left eye, the lasting proof of his narrow escape from the blast, a constant reminder of the price of their freedom. But the structure of his face, the imposing presence, was unmistakable. He didn't speak, just placed a small, carefully dried sprig of lavender on the counter, the simple, delicate scent of it instantly transporting me back to the nights of herbal teas and whispered secrets, the nights where our connection truly began. He finally looked up, his one good eye meeting mine, and his voice, though softer and edged with the wisdom of survival, carried the same deep, compelling resonance I remembered. You once told me this scent could calm monsters, Arya. I thought I might need it for the journey. I felt the tears fall instantly, silently, the culmination of a year of grief, healing and waiting, and I reached out my trembling fingers, tracing the jagged, pale scar that ran across the back of his right hand, the scar from the night he had punched the wall instead of me, the scar of his first act of restraint for my sake. Luciano had survived. He took my hand, his grip gentle yet absolute, and said softly, his voice full of the quiet light of shared rebirth, the only words I ever needed to hear, finally correcting the monstrous injustice he had imposed on us both. You were never my servant. You were my salvation, Arya. And now we don't need a kingdom. We just need this quiet light in each other. I spent so long believing I was small, believing my worth was tied to the title people gave me, maidservant, target, criminal. I spent so long believing that my only value was what I could clean, or what I could heal, but never who I really was, never the fierce intelligence underneath the uniform. But what I learned kneeling on that marble floor, and then standing in that glass cage, is that you are never small when your spirit is unyielding, and your true power is your ability to choose who you save and when you fight. Your worth isn't in your title or your bank account, but in the quiet, absolute moral strength you carry with you, even when the world is trying to burn you down and reduce you to nothing. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.